What up, people? Frank Lemonade here, and I want to start this off by just straight up telling y'all I am biased. Um, and I will not ever say I am unbiased because I do not think it's possible to be completely unbiased because, bias is basically having, some kind of preconceived thoughts going into something. And, when it comes to video games, um, there are certain things that you have, certain beliefs that you have, um, based on what you own and what you don't own. And in the 90s, I had a Sega Genesis. So I believed that Sega Genesis was the superior system because I experienced Sega Genesis games. I played through Sega Genesis games. I did not have immediate access to a Super Nintendo. I had I had some cousins who had a Super Nintendo. Um, but that was not my primary means of playing video games at the time. So, in my opinion, Sega Genesis was a superior system because I had Sega Genesis. My friends who were immediately near me and lived close enough that we would hang out and play had Sega Genesis. So basically, I had a Sega Genesis childhood up until um I got a Sony PlayStation. So literally any Nintendo system or a Nintendo game that I play, I am going to have a little bit of a bias because I didn't grow up with it, and it's not something it's something that I played um as I was older, so late teenager, early adult, because I believe I got my I got my Super Nintendo in like 2008, I believe. Um, so with that being said, this is X-Men Mutant Apocalypse for the Super Nintendo. And growing up playing X-Men 2, Clone Wars, like having that game, and I had a friend who had the first X-Men game. I did not originally own it. Um, but I had a friend who had the original X-Men game. So that's how I knew how bad it was. And yeah, it's just it's the experience that you know versus the experience that you don't know. So I would say flat out that I believe that if I was a Super Nintendo kid, um, and I had this X-Men game, I don't. I think it would be an overall just net negative experience because X-Men 2 Clone Wars is very reminiscent of the comic book, not the comic book, the cartoon series. Um, because it's based off of episodes from the cartoon series. And from the beginning, you are put in a scenario, you are surrounded by robots, you see sentinels right away, and it is very reminiscent to the X-Men cartoon. This game the on this hand, I don't know which hand. Um this game does not feel like I am playing um I am playing X-Men the animated series. I am playing an X-Men game. There are familiar faces to it, but this is just a whole different thing. Like I'm fighting these dudes. I don't know who these dudes are. I don't know why this guy is just like lobbing grenades. Um, it feels so unfamiliar. It feels so unfamiliar from just um the game that is X-Men 2 Clone Wars, which I do think is one of the most perfect X-Men games to date. Um but it that is my biased opinion. I have not really encountered um and I also did not watch a lot of like the later X-Men cartoons. So like I remember watching X-Men Evolution in the early 2000s, and I was it was okay. Um but after that I didn't watch any of the other X-Men related cartoons that came out. I think a lot of those were like after my time, uh and my overall interest had like somewhat diminished overall when it came to you know watching X-Men. um I would say after what is the third X-Men movie, I think it's X-Men Last Stand or whatever. um I really stopped paying attention to the X-Men and like X-Men games. I do have what is it? The X-Men game for PS2. Forget what I forget what it's called right now. But the X-Men fighting game Next Dimension, X-Men Next Dimension. I have that one. And I do have the first X-Men Legends game. So, um maybe I'll play those later, but you know, here we are with this game. And I must say, like, the beautiful thing about the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo era was that Super Nintendo games were Super Nintendo games and Sega Genesis games were Sega Genesis games. So you could have, say, Aladdin for the Sega Genesis and Aladdin for the Super Nintendo, and those be two entirely different games and different experiences. And that is something I don't feel like happens that much today. And I also just think it's because I don't know, I think information is too I don't know, too quickly accessible. Um, with games like this um, back in the '90s before like home internet was popular, uh, you were kind of taking a shot in the dark. You were going by cover art and what you think that game would potentially be. Um, and sometimes the cover art did not match like what the experience that you actually got when you played the game. But at the end of the day, whether it was fun or not, it was kind of a risk. And I think at the same time, there were more games that kind of came out Um, or maybe it's because um, of my timing getting into gaming. I felt there were more games that were widely available. I didn't get a PlayStation 1 until um 99. So I was playing the Sega Genesis up until that point. And I think that was relatively common because the Sega Saturn didn't really pop off in the United States. So you know, a lot of people, most people, to be perfectly honest, um, if you weren't like heavy into video games, you didn't even know about the Sega Saturn. Nobody was talking about the Sega Saturn. Sega Saturn wasn't like they didn't sell the Sega Saturn games at KB Toys or anything like that. So like you had to go somewhere that sold Sega Saturn games. That wasn't like they didn't sell Sega Saturn games everywhere. And there are tons of videos that exist on YouTube that gives that full breakdown as to why they didn't sell Sega Saturn games everywhere. I would say, as somebody who was literally a child in the 90s, I was not aware that that was the situation with Sega Saturn. Um, I did get to play a Sega Saturn for like a summer in 1996. Um, and that was my only experience with the Sega Saturn. It was a system that was relatively held in mystery to me, and I was like always infinitely like interested in it. Um, and being a child with no like real like an actual grade school going child with no means of income, you know, it was a game, it was a system that remained a mystery to me because by the time I had the money to afford getting a Sega Saturn, they stopped selling them at freaking Funko Land. And yeah, Funko Land, that's you know, what GameStop used to be back in the day, for those who aren't aware. Um GameStop used to be a bunch of stores. And yeah, then they all converged and became GameStop, like the Prime Sentinels and X-Men 97. But yeah, in terms of gaming and experiences, I would say that the Sega Genesis was the better experience, and Capcom had a better relationship with um, Nintendo than it did with Sega. So I didn't really encounter a lot of Capcom games because Capcom was notoriously a difficult um like they just made difficult games. Like the earliest game I remember playing from Capcom was Super Ghouls and Ghosts, and I thought that game was insane. And you know, that just is my memory of Capcom, and just like the I guess mental note that I took. It's like they make weird games, kind of difficult, but you know, um, they didn't to my and I didn't have like a robust Sega Genesis collection. It's just that none of the games that I owned when I was a child was made by Capcom. So I don't know if Capcom didn't make a lot of games for the Sega Genesis or not. I'm not looking that up right now. But yeah, at the end of the day, that is kind of what I think about this game. I don't think I would have enjoyed this had this been my childhood X-Men game. Like it's not really X-Men to me. And maybe Clone Wars has a little bit too much robots and not enough humans for it to be X-Men. But I take the robots over these like weird looking guys that are like shooting guns and throwing grenades and punching. Like I don't even know what's going on. I know we're on Genosha and it's like some kind of plot. So am I finding humans? Because like, isn't Genosha like um what's his name? Magneto's planet? I don't know what's going on. Um, but I don't know. Um, Probably gonna talk more about some other shows later. Um, in terms of games, I definitely think I'm gonna go through some particular Sega Genesis titles because that was again like that was my main system and like I can hit you with like memories with that. Otherwise, I'm just kind of like riffing and I kind of like going off of memory than I do like trying to I don't know. Anyways, peace out.